Sekiro is a good game. No, Sekiro is a great game, but it's not perfect, and after 4 games, it can be frustrating to see From Software having the same problems in each title. Before we get started, let's establish that I am an idiot. I spent 4 minutes in the tutorial going in circles because I didn't see a door. That was lit by a torch. I died 144 times beating the game, and the first 2 were me jumping to my death. It's actually 275 if we include the resurrections. You can feel free to ignore this. If you want, refer to points 1 and 2. But there were flaws I couldn't help but notice. If you disagree, you can leave your thoughts in the comments. I'm interested to hear other perspectives. For now, you clicked on my video, so now you get to listen to me complain. I mean, you could leave, but you wouldn't be playing FromSoft games if you were going to back out of a challenge, right? Speaking of being challenged, Sekiro is said to be harder than the Souls series, but it's not. Not really. It's faster, sure, but so is Bloodborne. But where Bloodborne was a natural evolution from dodging to dodging aggressively, Sekiro went from Souls dodging to parrying aggressively. There is a dodge, but it's more for positioning. It's there for closing gaps more than avoiding attacks. Your other mobility options are more suited for helping you with that, but for the most part, parrying is your best defensive tool, and with the way the posture system works, it's a crucial part of your offense. At its best, the back and forth of the fight and the clanging of metal is just pure dopamine. At its worst, though, it's an exercise in frustration and tedium that gives FromSoft's games the reputation for difficulty and punishment in the worst way. The problem isn't that the games are too hard, though Sekiro's wonky difficulty curve is something we'll talk about. The problem isn't that the games are too hard, the problem is that From doesn't know how to teach the players how to play their games. I don't mean teaching the controls. Players can figure those out pretty quick, and they don't need this giant text box breaking the flow of playing the game. But the mindset of the game. How aggressive should I be? How cautious? Should I treat items as rare or use them as much as possible? Which skills would be a better investment for me? What are my options in combat? Are they, on average, reliable, or will it be specific to the encounter? The player learns these through the course of the game as they play, but the fundamental mindset should be drilled into the player as early as possible. Honestly, I'm not sure who would have more trouble with this game. People who have already played Dark Souls likely won't make progress on fights playing like a Souls game. People new to From games will likely die repeatedly as their attacks are ignored and interrupted. Eventually, both sorts will either learn or quit, which is normal. Not everyone's going to like every game. But Sekiro could do a much better job about showing the player the way that they should engage. Talking to someone who has beaten Sekiro, they'll often say that they were just pushing through until everything clicked. It's just unfortunate that the most common place it clicks is Genichiro on Ashina Castle, hours into the game. This is actually the second time a player fights him. The first time is at the end of the tutorial, in a fight that the player is supposed to lose. While it is possible to win, the result in the story is the same, and it's clearly not expected for a first-time player. This is fine, I guess. It's there to tell the player that they're going to die a lot, as if they didn't know that based on From's reputation at this point. I think it's annoying that they do this. I think it's played out. It doesn't actually improve the game, but on its own, it's whatever. This wouldn't be a big deal were it not for what comes next. There are 2 walls that the player can hit in the early game. The mini-bosses can be tough, but can be skipped, or you can use stealth to take out their first health bar. But at some point, you'll come down to a choice between Juzo the Drunkard or the Chained Ogre. The progression up to the Chained Ogre is essentially linear from one encounter arena to the next. Halfway along this path, you'll open up the Harada Estate as an extra area to work through. It's heavily encouraged, as that's where you'll find the Flame Vent to help with the Ogre and other useful tools. Once you get to the Chained Ogre, you can even overhear a tip to use fire, strongly signaling to go to the estate if you haven't. You likely won't have enough health to deal with Juzo, although if you deal with all the mini-bosses, you'll be close. So you'll go to the estate, up to the boss, working your way through hordes of enemies, likely using stealth and taking it slow if it's your first time playing, making each death drag on because you haven't learned to just run past the runback yet. Then you hit Juzo himself. At first it looks like the game wants you to stealth the encounter. There's a large number of enemies on the way to the fight, grouped in a narrow corridor, and a large number around Juzo. But this makes for a long and tedious runback. Stealth is there for starting engagements, hitting the biggest threat and then finishing the rest of the mooks. There are areas where it's possible to fully stealth your way through, but it's not a robust system. If you are caught, your options are to start fighting or back off entirely and wait for the AI to reset. There is no alert state between combat and being hidden. If an enemy has seen you and you leave line of sight, they won't try to find you based on your last location or try to cut you off by heading out around the map. Instead, they will know your location at all times. Once you're noticed, the only thing that matters is your distance. When they start leaving combat, they'll slowly back towards their position until they reset. It's the same behavior that the AI has had since Souls. It's just your tools that have been expanded for this. And this is fine. If I wanted a full stealth game, this would be awful, but that's not what Sekiro is trying to be, and I'm not going to judge a game on something that it's not. It's just that playing with pure stealth almost works for the early stages, but the longer you lean on this, the worse experience you're going to have. Speaking of almost working, if you're skipping the mini-bosses, it seems like you'll make progress until you hit the wall of the ogre or the drunkard, but what you're actually doing is skipping what little training the game is offering you. I would recommend doing the early mini-bosses as soon as you see them, since it's your only way to significantly increase your health, which you'll need to deal with the nightmarish amount of damage you'll be taking later on. I couldn't blame a player skipping these thinking they're optional. They'd probably plan to come back later, since getting stuck on any of these bosses is a drain on resources. From's items being consumed on use even after death isn't anything new. The shinobi tools, however, use emblems. It's obviously a choice to keep the player from spamming them to victory. They're supposed to be an extension of your main toolset, not a replacement for it. But they can do that with just having the limit tied to per rest instead of being another thing that you need to collect. Once you're out, your choices are either get good enough to where you don't need them, or grind them up. And the grind is just pointless busy work. There's a difference between difficulty and tedium. There's really no reason to have it work this way. There are skills that can help, some of which use the emblems so have the same problems, but plenty don't. Their problem comes from not knowing what's going to be practical to help you until you've already spent the points on them. I have the same problem with the prosthetic upgrades, honestly, and it came back to bite me hard, but we'll get to that later. If you don't get the hang of these quickly, you'll likely find you don't have the ability to practice with them anymore. Like the health being locked behind the mini-bosses, the early game can become hostile to a new player. It makes a rather odd difficulty curve where the better at the game you are, the less of a challenge you'll have, and the worse you are, the more likely you are to lock yourself into a situation that feels impossible to overcome. It should be noted that it's never actually impossible, and that's one of the things that makes From games so great. You can always overcome their challenges, be it by being clever or skilled. There's always a way to beat them. What would be ideal would be a location where the player can hone their skills without risking resources until they have a grasp on the game. And at this point, people who have played the game are wondering why I haven't talked about Hanbei the Undying. Hanbei being an NPC you can fight over and over again after practicing the basics. It would be exactly the training arena I'm talking about, if only it weren't for the fact that he's even easier than some of the basic enemies. It's so easy that there really is nothing to learn from him by the time you're out of the tutorial area. It teaches the controls effectively, but you learn those in the tutorial area. It fails entirely to teach about the pacing and positioning of the fights. In other words, it fails at being a combat tutorial. Why have a combat tutorial if it won't teach me combat? The Dragon Rot mechanic doesn't help here. The game makes it seem like a big deal and that it's going to be a huge punishment for failure. It's not. I died 144 times and I had the Dragon Rot happen a total of 14 times. But the game presenting it the way it does can add on to the stress of failure. Depending on the player, it's somewhere between cruel and pointless. It's there for the story, immortality bad, but I think the story on its own does well enough to demonstrate that, and even mechanically, the cycle of death and struggle is enough to get the point across. I know I'm spending a lot of time on a very small portion of the game. It only took me 3 hours from the start of the game to getting past the ogre, but it's the part I find the weakest, the new player experience. It's frustrating because the solutions are so easy to implement. They're halfway there, but then stumble at the execution. The text boxes that pop up tell me the mechanics, but they don't teach. Either have Hanbei fight at the pace that you're actually expecting the player to work at, or introduce a boss early on that will actually help the player learn. Maybe make it so that the player has to beat Junichiro in the tutorial, or maybe have Lady Butterfly happen sooner. You could even have a weaker fight and a stronger rematch like you have with Owl. I really like the fight against her, and she's good at training the rhythm of combat. Clang, clang, spark, time to deflect, repeat. You could even keep the fight the same if you made Juzo less annoying to beat, maybe tone down the damage if we're expecting the fight to happen before the ogre, but that's it really. Of the two walls, Juzo is actually the one I have the least problems with as a fight itself. He just does a lot of damage and can be annoying to get to. Once I got some health and learned to jump into the fire to avoid the mobs on the way to him, it was actually a fun fight that rewarded being fast and aggressive, dealing with the mobs around him. The ogre, however, combines some of the more annoying aspects of From's designs, starting with grabs. I can't stand grabs. They always seem to magnet onto me if I was even the slightest bit off on my dodge timing. And they're usually an instant kill or close to it. It's just, sorry, game's decided it's time for you to lose. They're bad enough on their own, but the environment design can just be hostile. I don't mean the cliff the ogre can throw you off of, that only happened to me once, and I barely had enough health after being grabbed to keep fighting anyway. But the steps that make up a sizable portion of the arena. The AI ignores how the slope works for the most part, it just slides through to where the attack will take it. This can make timing deflections feel tricky and grabs even harder to dodge. It's not horrible here, but it's the start of a frustration that's going to pop up again later, but worse. I'm also not a fan of the way the perilous attack warning is implemented. It's not a big deal here, but another decision that snowballs later on. It's too big, too bright, and the timing for it is weird. You don't dodge or counter when you see it, but when it starts to fade. And if you have the camera positioned right, it often covers the model, hiding the move you need to counter. I would rather have something like the flash the quick draw has, just make it a different color. You can even differentiate the attacks even more, but that's not necessary. Just let me see what the enemy is doing so I can react accordingly. After beating the ogre, the next big event is stealthing through the Snake Canyon. I know a lot of people love this, but to me it just feels like every other forced stealth section in an action game. It's supposed to be a big surprise considering how grounded the rest of the game has been, but its flair wears off after you've seen it once and know what's coming later in the game. It falls flat for me, but it serves its mechanical purpose of breaking up the pace a bit, and it's ultimately inoffensive. It's quick too, which is always good. After the snake, in a short arena, is the actual boss of the area, Gyobu. I like Gyobu. His massive weapon might trick you into thinking that this will be another fight where you have to dodge instead of parry, but that's a failing of presentation, I think. If it wasn't for the ogre immediately before it, I think the expectation would be set differently. Since he's mounted, he can cover a lot of ground and will sometimes run into walls at the edge of the arena, but because he's so aggressive, you just have to wait a second for him to run back towards you. I think the game would be improved by moving the ogre to after him. If you don't want to give the player the firecrackers before the ogre, you can move those as well. I don't think they need to be moved, but if the intention is to push the player towards Harada Estate, it wouldn't be a big deal to move them. Gyobu makes a better check for the skills the player has been building, mainly parrying. With simple perilous attack to dodge, as well as a good place to introduce the grappling hook as a tool in combat. You can use the grappling hook on the ogre occasionally, but you don't lose anything except maybe time by not doing it, and it can be dangerous if you time the landing wrong. Gyobu's attack can be deflected, which shows the player is mastering the main defense, but using the grappling hook rewards taking the offense and controlling the pace of battle. It's a good fight, and a satisfying victory. After beating Gyobu, I went back to Harada Estate to finish off Juzo. It took me a couple of tries, but with the boost to attack from Gyobu and the health I had from the mini-bosses, a few uses of Roll and Slash kept the friendly NPC alive long enough for me to stack damage on the drunk. After that, it was time for Lady Butterfly, which started with a text box explaining health and posture. I guess she's the first boss to where this is relevant. Before it was either or. This is another fight I like, but I have a few problems with it. The first is the Snap Seeds, or Snap Seed, rather. The game gives you only one before the fight with her to use on her illusions. I don't like using items in From games at the best of times. If it's close and an item will push me over the edge, then I'll use it, but any other time it feels like I'm just immediately throwing it away. It's a waste. Thankfully, the Snap Seed isn't actually needed, but this ties into the other issue, which, to no one's surprise, is the camera. There are pillars around the arena, and as far as I can tell, they're there to help hide from the barrage of projectiles the illusions create if you don't use the Snap Seeds. The problem is that if Lady Butterfly gets behind them for too long, the camera will lose lock-on, and like all large terrain, they have a tendency to push the camera around if you're too close. She can also jump over your head and break lock-on? I don't mind that on this one. It's an intentional part of the fight if you push her too much. What I mind is that the lock-on doesn't break until the camera is on the floor. Just break it immediately so I can look around and continue the fight. The next big sticking point for most people is the Blazing Bull. It guards the way to Ashina Castle, and the last big fight before you'll have more control over the order you approach things. You can deflect the bull's attacks, but you'll take fire damage. It's still worth it if that's your only choice, but the bull's here to tell you that some enemies need to be dodged. And like I mentioned earlier, your actual dodge isn't your best evasive tool. No, for this fight you'll be running in circles and getting hits in as the bull slides to turn. You can use firecrackers to stun it temporarily, just don't spam them like I did or you'll waste them. Since the bull runs a lot, it'll spend a lot of time running into walls. It looks silly, but if the arena were bigger, it would probably make the fight more annoying, as the bull constantly ran away from you. Once the bull's dead, you're supposed to go to Ashina Castle and fight Junichiro, but you can actually go to most other areas already to build up your resources instead. I went to Simbo Temple first to gain some experience. This led to some pointless wandering on my part later on because things hadn't spawned in yet, but I don't blame the game for me being dumb. There's some annoying enemies along the way, but you don't need to fight them, just run past and towards the Armored Warrior. He could kill me in one shot after a careless resurrection, but it was a fun test of awareness about the arena, and the camera never gave me problems despite the enclosed space. After the temple, I went to the Ashina Reservoir to fight the mini-bosses there. 7 Ashina Spears looks like it'll be an annoying fight to get to, but you can travel around the field and get into the tower behind him, a far enough distance that it'll break engagement with most things that might be chasing you. It'll even get you a sneak attack on the boss. This fight is mostly a test of how well you know the Makiri counter, which is fine, but it's yet another fight on a set of stairs, which means dancing around trying to keep the fight on level ground. Still didn't stop him from sticking on terrain. The other fight, though. If you know anything about this game, there's no way you don't know about this fight. The Lone Shadow in the Well is a frustrating fight against the camera and the cramped arena more than the enemy. His attacks are designed to push you around and force you against the wall, and the speed of his attacks means you have to be very careful about when you try to disengage to reposition. Healing is another thing you're going to be pressed on. You can run into the hallway for more space, but there's a good chance that it'll just lock you into a smaller arena. This is a posture fight, so while you waste time trying to get away from the wall, the progress you were making is being swiftly negated. There's no way that From doesn't know how frustrating fighting against their camera is. I first fought against it with a Capra Demon in Dark Souls. For a similar fight to be in this game and this far into their series, it has to be an intentional choice on their part. But an intentional choice is not the same as a good one. Every time I have to fight with the controls instead of the enemy, I am immediately taken out of the game. It's not fun. Thankfully, you can take off the Lone Shadow's first health bar with a drop attack. It has to be from a very specific location, otherwise you'll be pushed away from it, but getting that drop is essential to keeping your time in the well to a minimum. Moving swiftly on from that fight, I had Snake Eyes Shirahagi waiting for me at the end of this path. I gave it a few tries, but decided I was better off coming back after I beat Genichiro. So I warped back to Ashina Castle and headed towards the tower, with a side trip to greet the general, and a wave hello to the Ashina elite. Genichiro is another great fight. He can seem overwhelming at first, with the surprise third phase catching the player just when they thought it was over. But Genichiro is actually really forgiving. He doesn't do instant kill levels of damage, and gives you plenty of room to catch your breath and heal up. You're not punished for a single mistake, but you won't be able to win without understanding the game's mechanics. It's a posture fight, so backing off too long will reset the fight, but unlike some other examples in the game, this isn't a problem here. Genichiro's posture builds up so quickly that as long as you control the pace of the fight, you'll be fine, and by this point you should have access to each emoji double, allowing you to heal your own posture without having to back off. It's not required to win, your posture will heal on its own pretty quickly, and even if it breaks, you have time to recover. The third phase is more of the same, but with a grab and lightning added on. The grab does a lot of damage, but it's heavily telegraphed, giving you plenty of time to get out of the way. The lightning is just free damage. I was actually getting annoyed with myself because I kept jumping out of the way. I wouldn't mind the particle effect being toned down though. It fills the screen and it can be tough on the eyes. It doesn't affect the fight. Once you see the lightning, you're already putting in the proper inputs, and you don't really need to see the stage. I just want to be able to look at the screen without hurting my eyes. After Genichiro, I went back to Snake Eyes. There are two things that make this fight annoying. One is the arena. Surprise, surprise. You fight in a poison swamp and it's surrounded by enemies with guns in a long range. It looks like you'll have to spend time picking them off in each attempt to clear an area to fight, but you don't. Instead, you can swing around behind Snake Eyes, and even if the other enemies see you, they'll just fire into the terrain. You won't need to worry about them. You can even get a sneak attack on Snake Eyes, which is almost necessary because doing this will lock you into a tiny arena to fight in. It's not as bad as fighting in the well, but it's always annoying to have to fight the camera. The bigger problem with this fight is the grab. It comes in from overhead, making jumping to dodge risky. I was always more likely to be caught if I tried it. The small arena makes dodging difficult, but you can parry it as long as you can deal with the awkward timing. It's another fight where you have to chip down the health before getting a posture kill, but it's the grab that makes this fight a slog. This fight is mandatory, but the refight later on is not, and I chose to just run past it. With Snake Eyes out of the way, I continued on the path into the mist. The Mist Noble at the end isn't really the boss fight, it's the path to it, which is shrouded in mist and enemies born from the mist. It also hides several dangerous mini-bosses. I ran into a headless and noticed that even when I deflected the attacks, I would lose massive chunks of my health, so I ran past it. The game didn't like that. It kept the spooky music and screaming while I was trying to talk to the monk. If you have a problem with refights, then know that there are plenty in this game too. Thankfully, they're only copies with the mini-bosses, as refights with the actual bosses will add something new, usually extra phases with different attacks. The mini-bosses are also optional, which helps, but there's a point where it can feel more like padding than a proper encounter. Orin of the Water is another tough fight. She does a lot of damage very quickly, and it's easy for a single mistake to send you back to the idol. She backs away quickly, and it can feel like you're not making progress filling her posture bar. Not impossible, just tricky. Immediately after her is the Corrupted Monk, and this fight is a slog. She only has one health bar, but has an enormous amount of health that you need to whittle down to even start making a dent in her posture. Her attacks aren't hard to learn, but they do massive damage, making every mistake costly. There's some divine confetti nearby, signaling that you should boost your attacks with items, but you'll be disappointed by how small the boost actually feels. It says that it'll do more damage to spirits, but she's not a spirit, she's an illusion. It's still some level of boost, and you can combine it with one of the sugars. I just wish they lasted a bit longer. Honestly, you could probably take off a quarter of her health and have the fight be the same difficulty, because after you get her to half health, you'll switch to focusing on her posture anyway. I have a feeling I may have done things out of the intended order, but I think I ended up with a better experience for it. If I did this another way, I would be looking at back-to-back fights. From the Guardian Ape, I would fight Snake Eyes, a rematch with the Ape, with a second Ape added, Orin, Corrupted Monk, Owl, and then Corrupted Monk again. That's a lot to deal with. And that's two separate refights really close to each other, and an onslaught of difficult bosses. I could easily see getting frustrated with this and having put the game down for a while after it. Instead, I skipped the rematch with the Ape entirely, and separated the fights with the Monk by a decent chunk of the game, so it felt fresh once it came around again. I'm glad this is the experience I got, but I don't think it's a good thing to have to be lucky to have good pacing. The next step of the journey was back at Sinpo Temple. It took me a long time to realize I needed to go back to the altar in the main hall. A really long time. An embarrassingly long time. Most other items to pick up have some sort of particle effect on them to make them stand out, which I would have appreciated here. But I'm not going to fault the game for my mistakes, and I ended up exploring the rest of the stage more thoroughly, and getting some useful resources from it, so it wasn't all bad. The folding screen monkeys are alright. They're a puzzle rather than a boss, but the puzzle is rather basic. There are 4 folding screens, but 3 monkeys. One of the monkeys is invisible and is the easiest one to take out. Then we have a monkey that sees well, a monkey that hears well, and a monkey that alerts the other 2. Figuring out the rooms themselves is easy enough. The waterfall and the bell counters the hearing monkey. The dark areas counter the seeing monkey. The alert monkey can in theory be dealt with anywhere. Lure the monkeys into an area where you can kill them, while dealing with the terror monkeys that are assaulting you. It's simple enough to figure out, it's chasing them around that can be a problem. They're quick, and they won't always head towards a place you can catch them, but waiting for a bit instead of immediately chasing as soon as you see them can help place them where they need to be. I like the focus on patience here. It's fitting, given the area. The Sunken Valley and the Gun Fort after have some obnoxious enemy placement. As the name implies, all the enemies have accurate far-firing guns, and there's another Snake Eyes fight here. It's a small area, but if you try to engage with each enemy, it can take a while. But one of the tools you've always had access to, sprinting, can get you past it without hassle. Choosing not to fight is a valid tactic sometimes. A long-armed centipede giraffe waits at the end. It's an easy fight once you have the parry down, but it's yet another fight with an enemy that pushes you around a tiny arena. Once again, the camera is the real enemy. Just making it so that parrying properly doesn't push you would alleviate some of the problem, but that just hides that the camera really needs to be able to move through walls if they want to keep these tiny arenas. If you don't want to see behind the wall, you can put a filter over the camera to indicate that the wall's there. Hell, some objects already fade out if they're in front of the camera. The solution is right there, why aren't you using it? The Guardian Ape fight is interesting. You can deflect its attacks, but you're not likely to win this through posture damage. It's better to stay mobile and punish the ape for large movements than break away when it starts to rage. It's almost got a Monster Hunter flow to it. And right when you think you're done, the ape picks up his head and sword and the fight continues. I actually find the second phase a bit easier. It's mostly about spacing properly and parrying, then punishing his big overhead slam after deflecting it. He has a few perilous attacks, but they're there to make you back away so the fight can continue to test your spacing. I've never seen it use more than 2 perilous attacks in a row, so it's just a matter of patience to get your hits in. Once it was defeated, it was back to Ashina Castle to face out. On the way, there's another chained ogre, and it's just as obnoxious as always. It's another fight where the enemy can leap far distances and push the player around in a tiny arena. I tried to lure other enemies nearby to attack it so I could bounce aggro around. That didn't really work. There wasn't enough space to hit the ogre without also hitting them, and they died too fast to be useful anyway. Clearing them out did let me lead the ogre out of its tiny arena, and that gave me enough room to feel like I could actually fight the thing. Otherwise I probably would have skipped the fight entirely. There's another fight in the castle that you can't skip. It's not the Lone Shadow, and if you carelessly rush into the arena, you're going to be fighting 2 of them. If you're careful though, you can get a stealth shot on one and get 8 in the fight instead. Outside of the setup, there's not much more to the fight. You've done this before, it can just take a while if you miss punishing him for recovering his posture, like I did. Twice. Owl took me a while. Just under an hour altogether. Not the longest I would fight a boss, but a taste of what I would be in for in the endgame. Owl is tough. He's got all of your tools and then some, and he's not bound by spirit emblems. The firecrackers in particular kept getting me until I learned you could parry them. That, and any of his non-sword attacks when I had high posture damage kept killing me, as it would break my posture, and then Owl would immediately follow up with some massive damage attack. He could also turn off your healing with a smoke bomb, with a hitbox just small enough to be able to dodge and get a hit in. Eventually, I could reliably get that hit, so that attack and his big jumping slam were the attacks I looked for the most to get damage in. It was a slow victory, since those attacks were also one of the few times I could sneak a heal in. Owl punishes even the slightest mistakes. It's not so much a battle against an equal, as some have called it. Owl moves faster, does more damage, and has no limits on how often he uses his tools. Not to mention the attacks that can't be interrupted. It's a battle against your better, and the endgame is locked behind overcoming it. Side note, somewhere around here my controller started breaking down. The A button would bounce between not registering at all, and reading it continuously, and the bumper buttons would sometimes stick down. I was able to complete the game anyway, but if you see video from here on out where I'm either just standing or jumping for no reason, or trying to use a combat art immediately after blocking or attacking, that's the controller getting in the way. It wasn't consistent enough to where I had to stop playing, and thankfully most of my deaths were unrelated to it, but it definitely started to wear on me in the endgame. Speaking of the endgame, after beating Owl, I went back to get the true ending ready. I figured after beating Sekiro, it would be a while before I went back to it, so I wanted to see what the true ending was. This took me a half an hour. From's quests can be esoteric at the best of times, and they're one of the reasons that second playthroughs of their games usually involve a wiki, and yeah, I used a wiki for this. I see people saying that Elden Ring's open world broke the quest design that they use, but it had been straining from the start. I don't need quest markers, or even a journal, though I wouldn't mind a transcript of the dialogue. All I'm asking for is some context as part of the conversations. I can't read your mind from, you need to show how you got from A to B. A wish granted, I guess. Here's the steps I needed to complete the return ending. Step 1. Talk to the Divine Child. Request rice. Step 2. Eat rice. Step 3. Leave the area. Step 4. Repeat steps 1 through 3 until the child is tired. Step 5. Give her a persimmon. Step 6. Ask for rice. You'll receive rice to give to Kuro. Step 7. Give rice to Kuro to get the rice balls. Step 8. Give the Divine Child Holy Chapter Infested. If you didn't pick it up, you need to go get it. Step 9. Go to the Illusionary Hall to talk to the Divine Child. She'll tell you to seek a monk. Step 10. Go to the monk in the cave at Simpo Temple, loot his corpse. Step 11. Go to the Divine Child again. She'll tell you to get the serpentine fruits. Step 12. Get the fresh fruit from the serpent at Simpo Temple. Step 13. Get the dried fruit from the serpent in the cave by the gun fort. This requires a brief stealth section where walls can attack you. Step 14. Return to the Divine Child and give the fruit. Step 15. Rest, then eavesdrop. Step 16. Rest, then talk to the Divine Child to get the frozen tears. Now you have everything you need for the return ending. That's excessive. And you need a rest between every step. After a point, it just starts to feel like padding. You can cut out the first half entirely and not lose any context for the rest. If this is what From thinks a direct questline looks like, it's no wonder the quests in Elden Ring turned out the way they did. Then again, the quests in that game that can actually change the ending are closer to the direction I would like them to take for all quests, with a good variety of telling you where you need to go versus rewarding more thorough exploration. With the setup out of the way, I was good to go for the next area. The start of the Divine Realm is blocked by the Corrupted Monk again, but with 3 health bars this time. It's a better fight, since you don't need to slowly whittle down the health to make progress on the actual goal of filling the posture bar. You should have already learned her moveset by this point, and she only adds 2 more attacks in her later phases. She's not a pushover, and it definitely took me a few tries to get down, but she's a good start to the area. The Divine Realm itself is simply gorgeous, and I would have liked to see a few less caves and a bit more of this. The enemies can be tricky. The Okami warriors can stun like you, which I'm never a fan of. I'm not a fan of punishing the player for being punished, but they're fast to take out in exchange, and you almost never need to fight more than one at a time. Lightning makes a return, giving you a chance to practice against it since it's coming up in the next boss. There's a moment where it looks like you'll need to fight a horde of these difficult enemies, but you don't actually need to engage them. You can just lure them out as a group and move past them. There's another rather basic stealth section with a fish, then it's time for the Divine Dragon. The Divine Dragon isn't a tough fight, but I did die once because when you're up close in the second phase, a decent hit can instantly kill you, or close to it. It didn't emphasize how lackluster the first phase is. It's just a little too easy and lasts a little too long. Whirlwind Slash helps in the beginning, but the enemies tend to spread out after that. The trees that break out of the ground can also force you to stop attacking, making this phase last even longer. The second phase is simple enough. Intercept lightning, return to Cinder. Just make sure that if you unlock the camera to find out which branch is getting the lightning, you relock it after you're on the branch. It's an easy fight, but it's one of From's best spectacle fights, and it's a fight with a large creature that doesn't mess with the camera. It's also a good pace breaker before we get to that boss. You know that boss. Every From game has one. Completely overtuned, does massive damage, probably has a large health bar, janky hitbox, might have a specific item for the fight that you're not guaranteed to have, and a display of just about every flaw that has been building up throughout the game all on display. For Sekiro, I am, of course, talking about the Demon of Hatred. And the frustrating part is that it's on the edge of being great. Most of the problems I have with it aren't with the boss itself, it's with what surrounds the fight. The camera, once again, foremost among them. The camera locks onto the demon's torso, and assuming it's not being pushed around by the garbage scattered around the environment, it looks like it'll work fine. That is until you're up close. You see, the demon is big, and both the safest and most effective place to be during the fight is right by his feet as you circle around him. This causes the camera to drunkenly bounce into the ground, obscuring the demon and just making the fight awful to look at. The fight can be difficult to learn already, this just makes it worse. Once you have the attacks down, it's actually not too bad, and most of the attacks you'll dodge at this range are fine, but it's a strain on the eyes and just something that has to be tolerated during the fight. The best example, I think, is where the demon will jump in the air and slam down in a fiery explosion. It's easy to dodge, just run directly away and grapple for free attacks. Past the first time you see it, you're never going to be hit by it. But the camera will shove itself into the ground trying to follow the demon as it jumps, only succeeding in giving a view of your character's crotch. It doesn't affect the fight, but it affects the game. What does affect the fight is the arena. Starting with a minor point, despite being absolutely massive, the arena can feel too small. The best bet for victory is to chase down the demon and stay close to it, but the demon moves fast and has a move that covers a lot of ground. It ends up on the edge of the arena more often than not, which can add to the frustrations with the camera, and making dodging certain attacks difficult. The real sin here is the hilly terrain. The demon's attacks are designed with the assumption that you're on even terrain, or close to it. But if you're on a different elevation, the tight windows to dodge become even tighter. That's the best case scenario. There's this one attack, though. After the demon charges, there will be a delay for you to close the distance. Then as you're approaching, he flings a set of fireballs in a wide arc, and follows up with another set if it hits you. Getting hit by both is an instant kill, and being hit by the first will bounce you into the second. If you're far enough away, you can run backwards to dodge it, but usually you'll be too close for that to work. Usually, you can dodge it by running towards the demon, which will take you under the attack. But if you're on a hill when he does that attack, then you will be hit, and the fight ends there. There are other attacks that have similar problems with getting hit, because of the terrain and not because you made a mistake. The meteor he summons are one, with how much they home in, but they usually don't end the fight in one shot like the fireballs do. You can block them with the umbrella, supposedly, but since I never used the umbrella, I wasn't able to rely on it. You also can apparently use the malcontent whistle to stun him to stack on damage. At the point in the fight I found out about this, I had no spirit emblems, or upgrade materials, and outside of setting up the true ending, I didn't want to rely on the wiki for finding the materials, since I wanted to have a view of the game like a first-time player would, and I didn't want to spend time grinding. Fighting is fun, even when it can be frustrating. Grinding is tedious. After throwing myself into the fight over and over and over, I decided to take a different approach. By getting on the wall by the entrance, you can trick the demon into flinging himself into the void. It seems like an exploit, But From could have easily prevented this by just adding a small wall to the cliff, or even removing the tree that catches it while you climb the wall. As far as I'm concerned, From considers this a fully valid solution. It's thematically appropriate too. The Demon of Hatred is the Sculptor, a man who has been aiding you from the start, consumed by the flames of hatred and lashing out at everything around him. At the point you fight him, there's nothing left but rage, and just enough of a person to thank you for ending his rampage. What better way to fight the hatred and rage than by not engaging in it? Hatred fuels itself, but fades in the face of patience and understanding. I did come back a few days later to beat him, properly, since I didn't want the way I won taken away from my arguments, but I was getting really worn out on the game at this point. All the little things kept adding up, and combined with the demon, really killed my enthusiasm for this game. I wasn't gonna fight Bird Dad again, so that just left one boss to fight. I was almost done, right? I mentioned at the start I died 144 times. By the time I got to the Demon of Hatred, I had died only 65 times. The last two bosses together killed me 79 times, more than every other encounter in the game combined. The demon killed me 43 times. Ishin the Sword Saint killed me 36. Now, that number likely would have been higher had I not taken a break from the game for a while before going back to it. The Sword Saint is another long fight with 3 health bars and a mandatory rematch with Genichiro for every attempt. Genichiro on his own isn't terribly difficult, but it's just dangerous enough that a bad mistake against him means you may as well restart the fight. His big flaming sword attack has an odd hitbox, making it difficult to dodge when you're close to him, but getting behind him lets you stagger him out of his second slash. This really didn't need to be a fight you had to go through every time you fought Ishin. Ishin is tough enough, and doesn't need this extra fight tacked on. Ishin himself lasts a long time. The fight can be quick, since the first 2 phases are going to be fights against the posture bar, but that's only after you've learned and can react to his moves. Any slack in the first 2 phases negates any progress you've made on the fight, and mistakes accumulate quickly. Any wrong move can end the run. Dying in the second phase meant learning 1 attack at a time, and being sent back to start. Working my way through the phases I already knew, without making mistakes to practice against the move that was killing me, and maybe learning 1 more by the next round. Several of these attacks also have a weird delay to them, but they at least feel more consistent about it than, say, some of the more egregious cases in Elden Ring. I decided I needed a way to learn the move safely, without going back to the start. Using all the lessons I learned throughout the game, I found a way. With Ishin defeated and immortality returned, I finished my time with the game. Like I said at the start, Sekiro is a great game, and I enjoyed my time with it. But it's far from perfect, and by the end, I was ready to put it down for a while. More than anything, I want to see From Software improve their games, to make great games even better. And I don't see that happening by ignoring the flaws that are there when most of them have been there for several games in a row. Either way, I'll always look forward to seeing what games they create. Who knows? Maybe if we're lucky, we'll even get another Armored Core.